They called the place Willowmere, but names mean nothing when the secret beneath them eats the town. In Burke County, Georgia, in the winter of 1839, a woman of measured manners and chilling resolve kept a private mourning ritual that would unmake 3 lives and haunt a county for generations. Picture a plantation house wrapped in frost, shutters closed, servants moving like shadows, and one mistress who walked to the creek at dawn and shed her clothing like a priestess discarding ritual cloth. What followed was not romance or madness in the theatrical sense. It was calculated procedure carried out under the guise of healing. Listen closely. I need you to be present in every syllable. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Do it now and feel the small, electric permission that gives you to know what others would destroy. While you do, subscribe to this channel and tell me where you are listening from. City, state, or country. Because this story needs witnesses, and your location anchors it to the map of complicity. Cordelia Vance Rutledge arrived at Willowmere as a bride with the posture of someone who had learned to control outcomes. Her journals record an appetite for knowledge that unsettled neighbors' medical treatises, Latin phrases, letters with no return address. The plantation's fields produced cotton and silence in equal measure, and among the enslaved workforce 3 men held unusual roles. A carpenter, a smith, and a trusted attendant, each marked by a faint crescent of discoloration on their left shoulder blade. When Thomas Rutledge died under the weight of slow illness in late 1838, the household folded into mourning and efficient management. Cordelia's composure was precise, mechanical, but behind that composure was a narrower, colder purpose. In the days after the funeral, she summoned the 3 men to the study and spoke of a treatment. A European technique, she said, to restore constitution and preserve lineage. They had no choice. Ownership eliminated consent. The ritual began at Turkey Creek at dawn. The water was low and glassy, the air thin with the breath of winter. She instructed them to disrobe and to stand in a circle as she moved among them with jars, cloths, and a small black-bound book. Her voice was steady, not seductive. It was ordering and absolute. You will watch this unravel and you will know why. Mornings at Willowmere became instruments of control. Cordelia divided the day, household management by daylight, and at dawn a private hour at Turkey Creek that belonged only to her. She taught the 3 men silence, as if silence had been a profession. At first the changes were small: delayed answers, a loss of quick decision, a diminished pride in tasks that had once defined them. Neighbors shrugged and called it grief or fever. The quarters named it something else, a slow unsettlement that moved through cabins at night. Cordelia's journals, kept by lamplight, read like a surgeon's log. Measurements, tincture names, times, cryptic references to a correspondent signed only H. She wrote of experiments in blood and water, of mercury preparations and imported oils she hoped would restore what she called purity of line. She catalogued effects like an apothecary, noting adverse reactions, increased listlessness, altered appetite, a fog settling where clarity had been. She believed she was correcting corruption, an idea with its own moral logic. Outwardly, Willowmere remained respectable. Cordelia hosted neighbors, taught young women needlework, and attended meetings at the church. Inside, the household learned to perform normalcy. Margaret, the eldest daughter, grew watchful. She kept a hidden diary where her fear sharpened into observation. She followed patterns: her mother's damp hair upon return, the leather-bound book kept under the pillow, the small box that appeared and vanished. Margaret noticed too the subtle rituals, precise cuts made over a crescent mark, the way water was poured and words repeated. Slowly, work shifted from craft to repetition. Isaiah, who had built the barn with no blueprint, began to trace plans as if reading them for the first time. Caleb's forge produced uneven iron. Josiah, Thomas's old attendant, forgot orders he had issued the day before. They moved through tasks obediently, productively, but without that improvisational spark that once made them indispensable. Each dawn the creek took something from them and left something else in its place. A replacement that worked, but was not the original soul that had walked across these fields. By late spring, talk in Westboro turned from curiosity to disquiet. Rumors threaded through market stalls and barber shops, a tether between mistress and 3 men, a mourning ordinance that felt less like medicine and more like possession. Yet wealth and fear braided together, no one spoke their name aloud. Deeply rooted, by midsummer 1839, the signs could no longer be explained away by grief. Local physician Silas Peaton made a private note in his ledger the day he first saw Josiah carrying water, a gaunt frame, trembling hands, slow speech. He exchanged glances with Cordelia and left without pressing questions that might disturb the delicate balance of property and power. Doctors kept records, sometimes they burned them. The legal scaffolding of the county wrapped around the manor like invisible chain link. Margaret's diary became the repository of suspicion. She described afternoons in which her mother poured single drops from glass vials into a basin, the glass glinting like private currency. She wrote of being threatened in the oak grove, of bruised wrists when her curiosity moved too close. She wrote in trembling hand the names of the 3 men and the crescent mark on each shoulder. The diary also recorded an entry she could not reconcile: an arrival in early September, a carriage from Savannah, a man with a quiet face and an offer of expertise. Listen, if this thread chills you, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Your comment of city or state matters. It roots this tale into living maps of complicity and witness. As autumn edged closer, the plantation's rhythm shifted toward harvest and a duller unease. The 3 men performed their duties, but their eyes kept a distance only they could see. They began to sleep restlessly and to wake heavy. There were small accidental admissions. A servant claiming he had heard Cordelia reciting words in a language that sounded like Latin but was wrong at its edges. A child noticing that her mother slept with a small black book under her pillow. A neighbor reported at a county meeting his unease, but others chalked the talk up to gossip and the hazards of a harsh winter ahead. Rumors threaded into Wesboro, quiet concerns lodged at the clerk's desk, a merchant refusing service to avoid stain, and an inquiry dispatched from Savannah. Officials, curious and cautious, planned to travel in October. They could not know how much of Willowmere's truth lived buried beneath its floorboards. Deeply rooted. When the men from Savannah came, they expected gossip and perhaps embezzlement or a scandal suitable to polite discourse. They were unready for the pall of secrecy that smothered Willowmere. County clerks had removed pages from ledgers. Neighbors offered polite hospitality while their eyes fell away. The investigators found a household practiced in the art of looking ordinary. They encountered Cordelia in the parlor, calm, wearing a shawl and a face that had learned to negotiate grief into discipline. She answered questions with an economy of words that masked something colder. They began with the obvious. Inventories, letters, the ledger entries that might reveal motive. But it was what the house tried to keep sealed that mattered most. In a kitchen outbuilding they found a trap door concealed beneath sacks of root vegetables. Behind it lay a root cellar shut tight and smelling of old herbs and coal. The air there felt like a held breath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a tray of objects. Glass bottles with faded labels, scraps of parchment with words written in a hand that wavered between clinical notation and incantation. Listen and act. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Repeat it now. Even this private ritual feels like a small rebellion against enforced forgetting. Among the papers were receipts from an Augusta supplier, letters from an unknown correspondent, and entries that mentioned experiments and a treatment she called purification. There were notes about Thomas's last months and measurements annotated with cold numerals. The tray held no bodies and no obvious trophies of crime. What it held instead was the architecture of intent. The investigators left with copies of the papers and the uneasy sense that they had only lifted a corner of a curtain. Willowmere kept secrets that could not easily be laid open without breaking more than one life. The 3 men, questioned separately, gave fractured accounts: cold water, a book, small deliberate cuts over a crescent mark, an order of silence enforced by threat. Their speech wobbled between memory and absence. Margaret produced her hidden diary. Under pressure, she read passages about threats in the oak grove and the black-bound book. Cordelia denied wrongdoing, insisting on experiment and cure. The investigators left with evidence, but also with the weight of a community unwilling to act decisively and fear-bought agreement. Sequence. The investigation did not erupt into the melodrama outsiders expected. Instead, it tangled in civility. Local men of standing insisted the matter be handled with discretion. Pages were excised from ledgers, doctors shelved their notes, and whispers circulated about family honor and the dangers of scandal. Yet the papers taken from Willowmere told a different story, a woman obsessed with lineage, and a regimen that borrowed from medicine and something older, more ritualistic. Cordelia's own health, she wrote, had improved in ways she attributed to those morning procedures. Margaret's testimony made fissures in the household. She described afternoons when her mother returned from the creek with hands that trembled slightly and eyes that burned with feverish clarity. Cordelia's entry spoke of regained vigor, a brightness in her face she credited to the treatments. She wrote of measurements taken at Turkey Creek at dawn and the repetition of the ritual, recorded with the exactitude of a scientist. To some officials, the thing looked like superstition practiced with medical vocabulary. To others it looked like something worse. Listen and subscribe, and tell me the city or state where you are hearing this. Your location is a small, brave map point that ties a living witness to this history. Not everyone bowed to silence. A young overseer wrote letters that hinted at cruelty, and a house servant named Rachel later swore that Josiah sometimes stared at her as if the man inside were leaking away. Yet the plantation economy leaned on self-preservation. Selling a troublesome witness to distant traders was an old solution. The threat of being sold to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where men famously lasted only short years, was an effective deterrent against speech. In October, when Savannah investigators returned with warrants and determination, the community's complicity complicated law. Officials discovered odd preparations, scraps of foreign text, and a ledger where Cordelia had annotated dates and dosages. There were no frank confessions, only the steady collapse of memory in 3 men whose lives had been repurposed. The legal result was messy civil complaints were whispered away and some documents were quietly suppressed. But for those who lived Willowmere's daily reality, suppression offered little solace. Still, the human cost could not be erased. Months villagers noted absences and premature deaths misnamed in official records. Secrets hardened into family decisions. Willowmere's silence stretched like a vow over county. The public faces of Willowmere did not change. The house continued to stand in orderly fashion, shutters white against the fields. But behind appropriateness, a different logic governed evenings and the secret calendar of dawns. Cordelia's journals, copies of which investigators made before local men intervened, revealed correspondence with a figure signing only H. The letters suggested expertise, a physician or occultist supplying recipes and arcane terms. Dr. Silas Pitton, uneasy and compelled by what he had seen, altered his records in ways that would confuse later readers. He excised details and softened language. In private he told friends he suspected chemical compounds and deliberate impairment of cognition, yet his public testimony remained cautious. Law, reputation, and planter society demanded restraint. The county's officials moved like people balancing fragile glass. One false word, and the social structure might spill. Cordelia grew thinner and brighter with reckless intensity. Her face had a fevered tightness, as if a secret flame burned behind her eyes. She hosted assemblies, directed charity, and accepted condolences with the same composure she applied to her ledger. Margaret, sleeping with a diary hidden beneath her garments, watched by candlelight. She learned patterns, times, phrases, small gestures, and copied them, not to imitate but to hold proof. The 3 men, now deep into a different rhythm, showed clearer losses. Isaiah failed to measure stock by eye. Caleb misjudged iron. Josiah forgot routes he had walked since childhood. They laughed sometimes and shared meals, but the sound felt diminished, an echo of what had been. Many labeled it witchcraft, madness, or devilment. Field hands and old women offered names and charms. What Cordelia claimed to create remained private. In ledger margins she wrote of correction and preservation, of line, and of removing taint to restore vigor. Those clinical phrases betrayed an obsession older than modern medicine, the belief that blood could be refined like metal and that heredity could be sculpted. In that calculus, people were materials, experiments recalibrated until an ideal remained. That belief felt monstrous to those who watched, and it would not remain an idea. It would demand result and sacrifice. In the harvest months the toll accumulated in quiet ways. Sudden evenings when a laborer failed to rise, Small funerals routed through the family cemetery, records that labeled causes of death with polite phrases. The county register began to show patterns people later could trace, a cluster of early deaths among those who had been near the creek, a higher than usual number of illnesses among field hands and house servants. Cordelia's notes, when read in sequence, suggested correlation if not simple causation. There were nights when Margaret would sit by the window and count faces in the quarters, tracing who remained and who had been sold or had died. She wrote of a new tension: some families refused work, others whispered of escape. The three men's condition deepened into a blankness that felt invasive, their recollection eroded like limestone under water. Once proud in craft and wit, they now performed labor as functionaries. The community explained away some losses with weather and old disease. But whispers grew teeth. Neighbors who once kept polite distance began to trade graveyard stories in hushed tones. Traders received odd offers. Some families quietly removed certain names from wills. The economic logic of plantation life, credit, partnership, mutual benefit, began to shape the available moral choices. People learned which questions ended opportunities and which silence maintained livelihood. If you are with me, subscribe now and tell me where you are listening from. Your city or state. Your voice matters. Comment and become part of the witnessing that history tried to erase. Cordelia held her composure in every public examination. She painted herself as industrious and grieving. She called the procedures hydrotherapeutic measures and insisted they sought health for everyone involved. To many, she appeared a widow stretched thin by duty. To others, especially those whose kin had vanished, she stood like a woman who had learned the language of threat and used it to silence. An elderly woman named Ruth fell ill after washing at the creek and died within weeks. Her death certificate read consumption, though neighbors knew she had been healthy. A trader was offered a list of enslaved people for sale after several deaths. Rumors swelled that anyone who asked questions received an offer to leave or a thinly veiled threat, and silence became law. The day the investigators lifted the trap door and descended into the cellar, the county's long habit of looking away changed tone. Men who had once protected family names stared at bundles and bottles as if at the contents of an altar. The air was heavy with scent, old herbs, coal, and a faint chemical undercurrent that made some cough. There were more papers than anyone expected, receipts, letters, and notes in Cordelia's hand. Some pages described experiments. Others contained passages in a broken Latin, like script that sat between prayer and protocol. Among the trinkets found was a leather-bound journal, smaller than a ledger and kept beneath oilcloth. It contained methodical entries, dates, times, measurements, and fragments of ritual language. There were sketches, diagrams of the crescent-shaped mark, and annotations about where to cut so as to release whatever the notes called a stain. There were lists of names, each annotated with a short result: approved, listless, dead, a blunt ledger of lives treated as outcomes. Even the simplest objects had been catalogued with a clinical care that made the whole operation feel like an experiment rather than a crime. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Repeat it now and feel the small act of recognition that moves you from being a spectator to a witness. Confronted with this ledger, Cordelia explained in measured tones that she sought cures, that her methods borrowed from European treatments and desperate science. She admitted to rituals but insisted on intent: health, preservation, restoration. Some neighbors accepted her defense. Others heard ledger entries and felt the names of their dead press on conscience. Margaret, who had hoped law would rescue truth, realized that many preferred quiet arrangements to public scandal. The investigators catalogued the evidence but left uneasy. The documents made a strong case of intent, yet the county's loyalties and economies complicated prosecution, and fear bought agreement. The ledger's columns revealed where Cordelia's attention had landed, not merely on health but on inheritance. She annotated names with notes about parentage, origins, and perceived blemishes. The crescent mark that three men bore, that odd, pale arc on a shoulder blade, became a pivot point in her thinking. In her notes it was a sign both of craft and of lineage, a mark to be read and then acted upon. In private she wrote of cleansing bloodlines and repairing what she considered a taint. To hear this as a modern metaphor is easy. To feel it within a community still anchored to property is harder. Cordelia's obsession sat on a shelf of older ideas: phrenology, folk medicine, a colonial belief that bodies could be read like texts. She used that belief as justification, and the ledger functioned as both accounting and altar: names and outcomes, dosages and dates, a record that treated human life as an experiment with variables. Margaret tried to make sense of the mark. She spoke to elders who told her that certain families carried small birth scars and signs that early generations had believed in portents and marks. But Margaret could not find a comforting origin story. Instead, she found a sequence of use and advantage. The mark had become a reason to select and to act, a pseudo-scientific glyph read by a practiced eye. Outside Willowmere Market, talk hardened into accusation for some and defense for others. Men who benefited from partnership with the Rutledge estate framed questions as threats to trade. Women who had lost kin watched with a grief too sharp for public voice. The ledger and the cellar served as proofs, but proofs were not always enough to overcome the lattice of dependency that bound a county together. People made calculations: immediate peace or slow justice, prosperity or scandal. In the end, the ledger pressed a choice: public ruin or private settlements. The town chose settlements. Men were sold quietly. Some families took payouts. Margaret hid what she could, promising she would not let those pages dissolve into polite rumor. She would keep them, name them, and pass the truth on. They would survive as stubborn, living proof. As months folded into a new year, Willowmere lived under a brittle truce. Cordelia kept up appearances, and planter society protected its own. But the ledger and the diary moved in quieter hands. Margaret, who could not unlearn the patterns she had seen, began to act in ways small and dangerous. She catalogued dates, copied pages, and smuggled proofs to a cousin in Savannah who owed her a silence in exchange for money. She hoped papers in the city might reach someone who would care enough to force public reckoning. Her secret correspondence bore fruit in the form of a solicitor from Savannah who prodded at the edges of the case. He asked the right questions, summoned witnesses, and introduced a legal pressure the county could not fully ignore. Cordelia confronted anew, held her ground, and insisted the procedures were humane, therapeutic, experimental, language that had softened previous scrutiny. She refused to confess malice, and she refused to provide full explanations. The gap between intent and impact was where the law often stalled. Listen, if this unsettles you, subscribe now and tell me the city or state you are listening from. Drop it in the comments. Your name on that map pushes this story out of rumor and into witness. The solicitor pressed for arrests. A grand jury convened to review testimony. But evidence is a messy thing when it crosses a line into private property and household discretion. Men with stakes in trade and reputation maneuvered. Some testimony was quietly undermined, witnesses moved away, and a few essential reports were never entered into public record. In the end, the legal system produced a compromised result: censure without severe punishment, documents suppressed, and social arrangements that favored continuity over full accountability. Cordelia's reputation splintered. Some called her eccentric, others whispered of the creek at dawn where she bathed and performed routines with the three men. That image became shorthand, a taboo unsaid at tea and market, lingering in houses where neighbors slept uneasy, leaving a bitter unspoken mark. When official heat cooled, private habits continued. Cordelia returned to her routines with the same quiet determination as before, though now she moved with the knowledge that questions might come and then be smoothed away. Her journals, always more brittle in meaning than melodic, began to include marginalia that read less like scientific notation and more like memory. Symbols and phrases she underlined, an arc repeated until it took on the look of a glyph. Margaret noticed the repetition and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. These marks suggested a lineage of practice, a set of signs passed among certain readers who believed in the transformative power of pattern and repetition. Whether the glyphs meant anything beyond Cordelia's private shorthand is hard to say, but their repetition created rhythm and authority. She would trace the crescent like a signature and refer to the practice as cleansing. In the ledger, a word that had moral and practical weight for her. The three men remained altered. Some who had been sold wrote back in short, clipped letters that suggested relief or the necessity of starting again elsewhere. Others disappeared from the letters entirely. Those who remained at Willowmere kept their distance from gatherings, took orders without question, and rarely met Margaret's eyes. The plantation's rhythms continued, but with an added layer of inertia, people halfway present, carrying out motion without full inhabitation. Margaret, meanwhile, grew into a witness who could not be quiet. She began to copy the glyphs she found into her own private book, not to replicate their power, but to catalogue them. She wanted an inventory, a taxonomy of harm. In doing so, she turned the secret into evidence. That act of naming and cataloging would be the thing that kept the story alive through decades of polite amnesia. This accumulation of marks and measures echoed through generations, a stain recast as tradition unless witnesses like Margaret carried its weight forward and named it openly. Secrets have a way of seeding themselves when they are treated like tools. Cordelia's journal, copied and hidden by Margaret, became an object of interest for others who encountered it. Curious relatives, a distant cousin with fewer scruples, a traveling practitioner who saw in its recipes an opportunity. The ledger's language migrated into private letters and whispered instructions. What began as a ritual in a creek at dawn seeped into other margins of power, into household management, into small ordinances that regulated who might be chosen for treatment. A neighbor in an adjacent county adopted a phrase and a practice and marked a hand that bore a faint scar. A merchant, amused and experimenting, tried a tincture on his livestock and told no one when the animals responded oddly. The details shift across retellings, but the effect remained, a slow normalizing of techniques that blurred the line between treatment and control. Where once such experiments were isolated and private, now they developed into shared curiosities among a class willing to use any advantage. Margaret watched this spread with a terrible clarity. She moved her hidden copies across hands she trusted, each transfer measured and slow, like laying seeds into soil that needed care. She sought allies among women who had lost kin and among a handful of ministers who resented silence. But the web of economic dependence kept many mouths closed. People chose livelihoods over truth, shelter over scandal. Some who might have acted chose not to risk the delicate arrangements that kept barns stocked and ledgers balanced. Time dulled outrage in many quarters. New generations took Willowmere for granted, the house, the fields, the family name. Yet beneath that steady surface, the ledger's language breathed. It became a manual poured into other hands, sometimes adapted, sometimes transformed. The idea that someone could correct, blood, or erase undesired traits persisted because it answered a desire to control the unknowable. Control is a currency, and where power is uneven, such currencies multiply. Margaret's job, then, was to remember, to keep precise the archived evidence of those who were treated as means. She became, against her will, the custody of truth. In doing so, she shaped what future discoverers would find: not only a list of outcomes, but a map of how ordinary people get used by extraordinary ideas. Fragments later echoed in medical journals and in charlatans' hands, persistent and adaptable. War and economic upheaval changed the rhythms of everything, and Willowmere was no exception. Fields lay fallow, labor systems shattered, and family lines scattered. In the chaos of conflict, some records disappeared entirely. Others were carried away by people fleeing ruin. Yet the ledger that Margaret had kept survived through the war years. Hidden in trunks, sewn into mattress covers, or carried in the head of an old woman who pretended not to remember. Survival in those years meant making decisions that were at once practical and morally compromising. Margaret's efforts proved prescient. The ledger's survival was neither guaranteed nor accidental. She entrusted pages to people she thought would protect them. She bartered them for passage or for food when the house could not feed itself. After the war, when reconstruction came with new rules and new violence, the ledgers remerged in pockets, incomplete, fragile, but persistent. A nephew who inherited the house refused to burn the papers. Another sold some volumes at auction. Memory had a tenacity that outlasted polite forgetting. As Willowmere rebuilt, so too did a habit of quiet explanation. The Rutledge name persisted in some circles, rebranded through new marriages and new investments. The ledger became a whisper, again an old scandal to be used in family feuds or kept under polite control. Margaret aged and left instructions. She died still insisting that her papers be preserved for whoever could be trusted to read them honestly. She named custodians and warned them that forgetting would repeat harm. Over the decades, the ledger passed through hands that did not always read it. Some files were flattened by children who mistook their importance for mere antiquarian curiosity. Others were clipped out and sold to collectors who prized oddity over context. A portion of the ledger ended up in the possession of a regional historical society, misfiled and catalogued under domestic management. There it slept in a box, waiting for a patient historian or an accident of curiosity to bring its pages back into the light. Still, historians are patient hunters. The ledger's path to daylight happened slowly, through cataloging and curiosity. A graduate student in the 1970s cataloging the holdings of the regional society stumbled on a bundle of pages wrapped in oilcloth. She noticed the handwriting and the dates, and, struck by a peculiar combination of medical notes and prose, made copies before the archive clerk relegated the bundle back to its box. She wrote cursory notes and filed them among other curiosities. Decades of patient cross-referencing followed. Through the late 20th century, a small network of scholars cross-referenced entries, matching names in the ledger to death records, newspapers, and county ledgers. They found patterns that the original inquiry could not entirely resolve: clusters of unexplained loss, a set of 3 men noted in multiple accounts, and a consistent, cryptic notation beside certain names. Academic interest turned to ethical panic. Conferences debated whether to call it an isolated domestic abuse case or a broader pattern of institutional harm. Publication followed, then pushback. Family descendants, some of them holding land or titles, bristled at implications that their forebears had been complicit in harm. Local newspapers printed defenses of heritage. Legal descendants questioned the accuracy of transcription. The ledger, treated at once as evidence and as provocation, became a contested object. Yet the work of piecing together archives, oral histories, and surviving diaries began to create a fuller portrait of what had happened at Willowmere. Margaret's pages, once hidden beneath mattresses and trunk linings, served as anchor points for this reconstruction. Where the ledger's columns were clinical, Margaret's entries supplied feeling: a daughter's fear, a witness's accumulation of detail, the human names behind line items. Scholars learned to combine the sterile ledger with Margaret's diary and with other records to approximate the shape of events. In doing so, they discovered not only a story about a woman and 3 men, but a wider cultural pattern about power, knowledge, and the normalization of harm. The ledger forced a moral reckoning that communities must decide to face or avoid. Today, when we read these pages and trace the margins of Willowmere's ledger, we practice an act of retrieval. We pull a forgotten shape back into light and ask, what do we owe to those whose bodies were used as instruments for another's theory? The ledger offers no tidy answers, only evidence that a woman of social standing used her authority and knowledge to run experiments she believed would secure lineage and wealth. It shows how social systems protect ideas that fit their interests, even when those ideas require human cost. This is not merely an old scandal. It is a lesson about how authority and science can be mistaken for righteousness. The instruments are different now: microscopes, journals, specialized language. But the pattern persists when people with power decide that certain bodies can be used to test a hypothesis. Margaret's preservation of the diary and ledger means we have the raw material to judge and to remember. The work of historians, activists, and families in the present is to translate those entries into accountability. If you are listening now, subscribe and comment where you are: city, state, or country. Tell me your location and anchor this listening in the world. Your name will join a long list of witnesses those men never had. What follows from memory is responsibility. Institutions must answer and families must reckon with inheritance that includes harm. The ledger does not only indict Cordelia. It indicts the structures that allowed the procedure to continue: legal ambiguity, economic leverage, and social silence. Holding those systems to account is messy and often incomplete. But that is the work of repair. At stake is the difference between remembering as narrative and remembering as obligation. Descendants of Willowmere's enslaved community deserve more than stories. They deserve documented recognition, access to archives and platforms to tell their history on their terms. Local historical societies can partner to create memorials, release records, and fund oral history projects. Scholars should publish transparent work and lobby for records repatriation. We must also guard against sensationalism. Remembering is not a show, it's an act of repair and accountability. Take responsibility, share records, support memorials, and listen to descendant-led truth sincerely. Cordelia's later life had a curious pallor to it. She lived long enough to see the legal fuss dim and to watch the ledger settle back into household care. Her face kept a sharp, almost fanatical composure. She moved through rooms with the certainty of a woman who believed in a system she had built. Friends aged away, allies married and moved. The plantation shifted hands and economies. In private, she continued routines that to outsiders looked like eccentric habit. To others, they verged on shrine keeping. Margaret aged as a custodian of names, and her great difficulty was to hold grief without turning it to spectacle. She taught younger women to read and to care for papers. She told them some truths carefully, showing what could be shown without endangering those still living. It was a patient stewardship, a slow preservation of memory in forms that might survive neglect. Those acts of stewardship were themselves acts of resistance, memory stored against erasure, testimony kept against polite forgetting. Cordelia died eventually, as all do, leaving a rumor and a ledger. Her death passed through Wesleyborough's papers with a curt obituary. Widow Cordelia Routledge, age 62, and little else. The county cemetery recorded her stone carved and neat, with family names arrayed in expected order. People visited the grave, some in sorrow, others in duty. Her dying did not undo what had been done, it only closed one chapter. The ledger lived on, and the men who had been altered carried their marks to new places and fresh silences. The harm Cordelia inflicted had ripple effects beyond measurable death and sale. It reached into the ways families made choices about marriage, inheritance, and reputation. Men who had been sold carried silence. Families rearranged themselves to avoid association. Over generations, that rearrangement hardened into a social memory that favored erasure. Even as institutions now open boxes and digitize pages, the lived consequences remain. Descendants who might have had different fates instead inherited wounds and altered paths. Choose memory, refuse to be complicit in silence. Listen, history is not a passive archive. It is a set of reflections that change the person who reads it. As you learn the ledger's names and the creek's hour, you begin to feel the border between spectator and participant shift. That is the point. Knowledge is not neutral, it is an act that transforms the knower. If you are moved by this, subscribe and type where you are listening from, city, state, country, and mark yourself a witness. When you name your place, you take a small step toward making silence harder to hold. Margaret's project of naming created an ethic of responsibility that ricocheted across generations. The ledger taught patience and the persistence of small acts, copying a page, mailing a diary, keeping a stubborn memory alive when everyone else wanted amnesia. Those tiny acts were the lever that pried open silence. When we read those acts now, they ask us whether we will carry that same stubbornness. To preserve testimony, to support descendants seeking truth, to rebuke systems that normalize violation. The ledger exposes a kind of institutional manipulation that is familiar when property law, medical authority, and social deference intersect. People become instruments and assets rather than subjects. That is not only a historical observation, it is an ethical alarm bell for any era. The fact that Cordelia practiced pseudo-scientific rituals in 1839 does not limit the lesson to a curiosity of the past. In any time, people wield structured knowledge to justify harm. Our job is to hold those structures to account. If you are listening and willing, comment your location now. Join the map of witnesses. Your presence breaks the neatness of forgetting and places you, however briefly, on the side of memory rather than omission. Practical steps matter. Support local archives. Demand historical societies return sensitive materials to descendant communities. Fund oral history projects, and press universities to include reparative justice in research agendas. Advocate for markers at sites of harm, and ensure descendant voices lead conversations. Small public acts accumulate into structural change and persist. Control rarely announces itself as cruelty. It presents as care, as improvement, as the correction of an error. Cordelia used that grammar expertly, language of treatment, the guise of experiment, and the ritual that masked coercion. The ritual's repeated form, dawn water, measured cuts, litanied words, functioned like a machine for shaping compliance. Add to that economic leverage and social threat, and the result is a structure where dissent is expensive and silence routinized. Understanding that mechanism matters if we want to interrupt it. Those mechanisms are not unique to Willowmere. They are the instruments of psychological control across eras, procedural repetition that dulls resistance, technical language that legitimizes harm, a moral vocabulary that frames violation as correction, threats of economic ruin that close mouths. When these elements intersect, people become willing participants because refusal costs too much. The ledger at Willowmere illustrates this pattern with grim clarity. Entries of dosage and dates next to names show a systematic application of power disguised as care. As a witness to that pattern, your role is to learn how systems operate. Watch for the signs: euphemistic language in policy, private treatments offered without oversight, and the slow normalization of practices that apply only to certain bodies. Question the framing of improvement when it lacks informed consent and when it targets the vulnerable. Recognize that institutional silence is itself an enforcement mechanism, and that economic leverage will always be used to coral truth. The moral economy of Willowmere teaches another harsh lesson. Accountability requires public structures that can withstand local pressures. Courts, archives, and independent press matter when they are willing to hold power to account. When those structures are compromised by social deference, the ledger's columns show what slips through the cracks: human lives recorded as outcomes, not as subjects. In practical terms, demand transparency, independent audits of institutions, public access to treatment records when harm is alleged, and community representation on oversight boards. Support whistleblowers and protect their testimony. When communities choose economic peace over truth, hold them accountable through public record and persistent, patient inquiry. Memory without action is a courtesy. Memory with repair is justice today. The publishing of a comprehensive study, a careful book that knit ledger, diaries, and court fragments, changed the conversation. When the ledger's pages entered public discourse as evidence rather than rumor, people who had relied on plausible deniability found their stories harder to maintain. Descendants of those who had been sold or silenced began to claim lineage and voice. Local councils debated markers and memorials. University presses issued apologies for past omissions. Archives re-evaluated their holdings with new attentiveness. The book did not produce neat restitution, but it produced something harder: a conversation that forced institutions to reckon with omissions. Families who once defended silence now faced descendants who wanted names read aloud. Grant committees funded oral histories, historians recorded testimony. A small museum exhibit recreated the creek in sound and light to force visitors to listen rather than merely look. These public acts were imperfect, sometimes performative, but they created spaces where truth could be affirmed publicly. Margaret's ledger, the core of the book, became central to a controversial public debate about how to honor victims and what to do with culpable legacies. Some argued for reparations, others demanded the removal of family plaques from public halls. A common thread emerged: institutions, when pressed, could make choices that either conceal or reveal. The ledger had become a lever to press those choices. Where local governments chose transparency, they funded remembrance and outreach. Where they chose closure, they preferred that silence be the final answer. The men who had been altered by Willowmere's rituals remained hard to find in official memory. Their names, when recovered, were sometimes Patchy, Isaac, Caleb, Josiah, or variations of those names in record keeping. But as historians and families restored their identities, a pattern became clear. Treating people as instruments leaves generational damage measurable in lost opportunities, in marriages that did not happen, and in livelihoods truncated by chains of displacement. This is the turning point: choose obligation over comfort, demand truth over ease, let ledger's names shape how you act next. This is the final hour of the ledger's telling, and I ask you to be deliberate. If a story like this moves you, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me the city, state, or country where you are listening. Your location matters. It is a small act of testimony that maps the geography of witness. Do it now, and in the act of naming you step from spectator to participant in a long tradition of necessary remembering. The last lines of Willamere's ledger are not tidy. They trail off in blots and shorthand as if the hand that wrote them tired or was interrupted. Some entries end with notes about dosages or dates. Others end with little marks where the writer paused. Margaret's diary ends differently, with a list of names she wanted remembered, written in the careful hand of someone who believed that naming might protect. That tension, ledger as instrument and diary as human plea, is the final irony of the tale. What do we do with such an irony? We begin with acknowledgement. We teach the ledger's language alongside the diary's breath. We fund projects that let descendant communities decide how to remember and how to repair. We insist institutions disclose their records and act in good faith. We elevate witnesses and protect their testimony. We insist that experimental treatments have oversight and that power cannot hide behind polite terms. These are practical, imperfect, and urgent acts. But there is another task that is quieter and equally dangerous: the internal work of witness. Knowing changes a person. The ledger asks you to learn to live differently, to notice when language sanitizes harm, to refuse euphemisms, to speak names out loud, and to refuse the convenience of forgetting. The creek at dawn that once held Cordelia's secret now stands as a reminder water holds records too. In the act of listening, you have accepted that responsibility. If you will join this witness, commit to small, consistent acts, preserve records, support descendant-led initiatives, and speak when institutions prefer silence. Tell me where you are, subscribe, and make one small pledge in the comments. Let this story be the seed of change rather than the satisfaction of curiosity. When you leave this video, carry these names as a compass. Let them change your choices, your votes, your words, and your daily acts.